Hello and welcome to the Alpha Demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software, and I am pleased to present Sarah Mitchell, our Director of Customer Success. Sarah is here to give a presentation at the beginning. I believe we're doing uploading of images using Android, as well as other topics, but we are here to answer your questions as well. And you could type those questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, as a reminder, you can always send questions into guides, GUIDES, at alphasoftware.com. Hello, Sarah. Are you there?
I am, and I assume you can hear me.
I can hear you, and I can see your screen, although it may be paused.
Nah, I unpaused it.
Excellent.
There we go. All right, yeah. So yes, thank you everybody for joining us today. We are going to talk about mobile image capture, but as a reminder, coming up next week and later this month and parts of next month, we're going to be doing some deep dives in some of the new features that we added in the latest release of Alpha Anywhere, as well as this new one that's coming on May 11th. We're gonna do a webinar on CORS, cross origin resource sharing access. Anyway,
Could be. Yeah.
if that sentence didn't explain why we're going to talk about CORS, we're going to do a presentation on CORS because it's a concept that you need to understand if you are building mobile applications as well as trying to mix resources. So like downloading images into your web applications, posting stuff from other sites that isn't your server, and just understanding what CORS is, as well as a little bit, we'll touch on cookies a bit as well, what that is, why it's important, why you need to understand it, and how it affects you when you're building your web and mobile applications. So that's coming up in a month. Next week, if you're interested in IndexedDB with lists and client-side data cache, I highly encourage that you attend that webinar. We will be doing stuff with offline today. We will not be using IndexedDB. I am going to save all of that for Dion McCormick, who will be doing that presentation next week. So if you're hoping to get a glimpse of that today, we're not going to look at that. We will be talking about the file system, however.
And Dion happens to be in the audience today, so he can't
He
lose
is
without
in
a
the
getting.
audience. Yes,
So
yes. You can all wave to him.
Presentation. Exactly.
Yeah. So, and then if you didn't get a notice about this webinar and you're watching this on YouTube, we did have to make a new GoToWebinar meeting for these presentations. So you will have to register again if you haven't already done so. You can go over to our website, www.alphasoftware.com/weekly alpha anywhere overview webinar with a hyphen between each one of those words, and sign up again. And then you should get notifications for our next webinars, which are sent out about an hour before the presentation. And then also as a reminder, Alpha DevCon 2022 is coming up. It's coming up fast. We are already into April. We are almost halfway through April, and October really is not that far away. So if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, I highly recommend you do so now. The price will only continue to go up as we get closer to the date of the DevCon. So today we're going to talk about mobile image capture, and what we're really going to do is we're just going to look at setting it up with the list control and how do you configure the action JavaScript to upload that data, where you need to store your image data. If you don't want to store it in a database, what's required for that if you're a community edition or if you're using Alpha Cloud. And then we'll look at a demo that I built using Ionic Appflow, and I'm running on my Android device. Oh, this got an animation in it. All right, so very briefly, list control. Why list control? List control is a control in the UX component that handles offline, all your offline data for you. It's the only control that does it. And if you are building a mobile application and your users aren't going to have any connectivity out in the field, or may lose connectivity, but you don't want them to lose the ability to use your app, you definitely want to understand the list, how to use it, and take advantage of that when you're building your applications. And in our demo today, we are going to use the list to handle all of the image capture pieces, the creating the new record, storing the images, and then all the synchronization back to the server, and saving that into a Alpha Cloud test database, which is something we're also going to look at today. And I'm also going to give you a tip on how you can migrate data into your Alpha Cloud databases test databases very easily, or even out if that's the case. It's a very handy tool when you're developing. You cannot use it in a production application because we make no guarantees that your data is backed up or replicated to handle connectivity losses if a region goes down. So it's strictly for testing. It's got a 1 GB size cap on it, but it's very handy when you're trying to set up or design an application. And then, as I mentioned, Action JavaScript is what we're going to use for the image capture today, and specifically the image capture for list detail view, which has everything in it for you to interact with the camera and pull images from either the hard drive or from the device's hardware. So we're gonna do an overview of what's required to publish for mobile because we have done quite a few presentations over the last 6 months on what you need to do. So if this is your first time seeing these settings and you don't understand what we're talking about here, or you've never built for mobile before and you have more questions, please go up to YouTube. Please find our past presentations on building apps for Ionic Appflow and for building apps using Cordova CLI. For Android on that case, we will look at Appflow. We'll use Appflow today for an Android app that I put together. But these basic steps are what you have to do for any mobile application you build, regardless of the platform, Cordova CLI or Ionic Appflow that you use to actually produce the mobile application. So obviously the first step is to build your app, get that set up. In our case today, we also need to create an A5W page because if you publish to Alpha Cloud requires that you have at least one. It doesn't have to have your app on it. It can just be some text on a page. Or if you're building an app that you're going to install in App Store, it could be promotional text on your page that tells people how to go download your app. Throw that out there. Step 3 is something that everyone forgets to do all the time. We forget to do this ourselves internally. I forgot to do it today, trying to design my app for you guys to see the demo. You need to set the cookie same site policy to unset. If you're publishing to IIS or Alpha Cloud, that's in your web project properties. If you're using the classic server, it's in the classic server settings, wherever you've installed it on a server. This is important. It has to be unset. If it's anything else, your app will not be able to communicate with the application server to do all of the server-side stuff, like pushing the data up to store it in your database, or you're running a query to do a search on your database, or whatever other server-side things that you've got going on that are needed by your application. So this is very important. If you don't set this, it can manifest as a problem in a number of ways, like your data failing to sync or a cross-origin access violation, seemingly for no reason. It can manifest as your app just not responding. So if it's not set to unset, then that's the first thing you need to do to fix those issues. And it's very important. I cannot stress this enough. So once you've got that set up, you've got your app, you've made a test page or A5W page. In case of Alpha Cloud, not necessarily required for IIS or Classic. Your next step is to publish your application files to the application server. If you're using Community Edition, your only options are to publish to Alpha Cloud from Community Edition. But you need to get all those files up there because they have all the code in them for all your server-side scripts and actions. And then once you've done that, you are then ready to create a Cordova project, which defines all the properties of your mobile application, including the plugins that are required for it, the AJAX callback URL, which is directly related to step 4. And then once you've got that set up, you can then move on to building your mobile app on your desired framework. Again, it could be Ionic Appflow, or it can be Cordova CLI, which you set up and install manually. And then finally, you get to step 7, you install and you test your app. Install can happen on an emulator if you have access to emulators. If you have a device, you can install it onto a device. And then that testing piece is critically important. Again, step 2 is required if you're going to Alpha Cloud, because it wants to have a default page when you put something up there. So for today's demo, these are the things that are required. We have to have an Amazon S3 account, and we do have to have an Alpha Cloud account. And then that third one, if it isn't obvious, you do need a way to test your mobile application before you ship it, because how else will you know what you did is going to work if you can't test it? And that way can, again, be an emulator, or it can be an actual device. I have a device that we're going to test on today to show the demo. We're going to use Ionic Appflow, and Ionic Appflow itself requires some things. It requires that you have GitHub Desktop installed. It requires a GitHub account, which is free. And it also requires an Ionic Appflow account, which you do have to pay for. The smallest plan they have right now, I believe, is $50 a month. If you don't have to use Ionic Appflow to build your app, you can use Cordova CLI. Again, we did a presentation on this, 2 presentations on this last month, or maybe the last 2 months. So go check those out on YouTube if you missed them. But this is what we're going to use today. If you don't have an easy way to build, so Cordova CLI is too hard for you, which I thoroughly understand. It's command line interface. It can be a bit tricky to get comfortable using that. But if that doesn't seem like something you want to get into, and Ionic Appflow is just beyond your budget limitations right now, you can use Alpha Launch to test mobile applications. Keep in mind that you are limited to the plugins included in Alpha Launch. Alpha Launch is free in the App Store and the Google Play Store. You can download and install it, and then publish and install apps into Alpha Launch using a different process. We did a presentation on that last year, a while ago. It might be worthwhile to dig that up again and do a refresher on that in a future webinar here. But this is an option for you. If you don't know if the plugins that you're using are in Alpha Launch, there is a page in settings or an option in settings where you can go and just look at the list of the included plugins that are in the app. So I want to remind everyone this is an option for you. You will still need the application server to publish, but there are ways to you leverage live test for that locally if your device and your development environment are on the same network. So we're going to go to live demo. Really short presentation today. Again, questions. If you have them, type them now. If you have them later, send them to guides. If your question's really long and you need to send us pictures, send it to guides. Doesn't need to be about questions about today's presentation, but it's always nice to get questions about what we're demoing. So I have put together this component. It's a UX component. I've named it Photo Capture Basic. It lets you take a picture, enter some information, a description basically. It has extra stuff in it for capturing EXIF information. If we can get to that today, we'll do it. But I wanted to just show you very simply what it is. So here are the controls in the component. All of these controls were generated for me except for this button that is currently selected. I added this myself, but we can walk through that real quick after we do a little preview of what it is. And so if I do a full preview, you're going to see not a great app. It doesn't have any labels in it. It looks like the layout should work okay on a mobile app device, but it's really, really squished if you're in a portrait mode. So here's our list on the left. And if I select something, here's all the fields on the right. Again, not labeled. So I'd like to fix this up a little bit to show you guys what the process is for making a change and then publishing it up to Ionic Appflow and starting a build. But this is all it is. This is all added for me. These fields down here are EXIF information, which we're not capturing, but I added them anyway to the database. If we go and we take a look at the database itself, I initially created it as a SQLite database using DB browser for SQLite. And I created this table called photos. And if we, let's see here, can I modify it? Here, let's click modify table. This is what's in the table photos. It's got an ID, which is a primary key, and it automatically increments every time a new record is added. It's got a description field, which is text. It has image file, which is stores the location of where the image is when the list saves that information off. I've marked it as text because it's a text field, and not null. So we don't want to insert images that have no image file. That doesn't make any sense. So at a minimum, we're requiring that there's an image here. And then these other fields down here are not required. This is optional, but I wanted to just point out with Camera with EXIF, which is one of the camera plugins that you could choose from when picking a plugin for your camera capture. It gives you access to a bunch of different settings, which can either be stored as a JSON object in your database. So EXIF JSON would be the JSON object that contains all the EXIF information. Or you can split them out into individual fields. So date, time, altitude, latitude, and longitude. And these are all set to type text. SQLite has a very small set of data types. It has text, integer, see the drop down here, blob, real, and numeric. So I just stuck to integer and text. If you're working in a different SQL system, you're going to have a wider range of options like date time for a date time field rather than text. And then as far as geography is concerned, you could even go as far as to try to figure out how to store the latitude and longitude as geography data in your database if you'd like that. So this is the table. If you've been to some of our past webinars, we've talked about databases in Alpha Cloud. You may know that a SQLite table cannot be used as your data source up in Alpha Cloud if you're trying to store that table in your web root of your project because of how Alpha Cloud works. That data is not replicated. The changes aren't saved. It's always going to be the version that you uploaded at the time of publish. So it can't be really used as a data source. You'd have to host it on another server or use a service like Amazon's database services. And so recognizing that, couldn't use the SQLite for the demo. So I had to get this into a format that would work up in Alpha Cloud when I published it so that when we ran this on our mobile device, we could see it working in the real world. And so what I did is I created a test database. So if you have an Alpha Cloud account, if you come down, if you click on Alpha Cloud button on the Web Projects Control Panel, there's an advanced dropdown, and in there's something called Subscription Test Databases. This is included with your Alpha Cloud subscription, and what it lets you do is create up to 3 test databases. It can either be a MariaDB, PostgreSQL, or SQL Server test database, and they're all hosted for you by us. You get a maximum size of 1 gigabyte. But I decided to take this MariaDB instance that I had and set it up with our photos database. So we come in here and do actions. The way I set this up is first I created the server, which is pretty easy to walk through if you've never done it before. But you first create your server, and then after that's set up, I created a database. And what create database does is it lets you create a database in that MariaDB instance that won't have anything in it when you first create it. You'll have to add it. So this one already had some in it, and the one that I added was images. So I basically entered images into this field and clicked create database. And then once I did that, I came over to actions and I said get connection string. And I said save as named connection. And I gave it a name so that I could easily reference this database images. I picked images up here and I gave it a connection name and I saved it into my connection strings so that I could use that in the list. But the other thing I needed to do was actually add the tables. So if you look here, you'll notice there's no create table option. So if you have SQL Server Management Studio installed or some other client for working with MariaDB, you can open an SSH tunnel and use all the connection information that is available to you in that dialog to set up a connection and use a tool like that to build out your database. Or if you already have a local database that you're working with and just need to migrate it for testing purposes, under the Tools menu down in More, there's an option to export from a SQL database to another SQL database. And the way this works is you pick your source, so images. This is my SQLite connection string to that SQLite database I made. And then the target connection is that one that I saved from MariaDB, which is testDB images. And then I just copied the tables to the target database, and that was it. I was done. I got everything over I needed. And I did a little bit of testing to make sure it worked, and it does indeed work. So that's how I got things migrated. And again, if you didn't know about this, you know about it now. This is a handy tool for setting up test databases or migrating data between databases. It's also nice if you've gone off and you've built out your test database up in cloud and you want to get all that information out, you can just reverse this and bring it down locally where you need it. So that is how I set up the database. And then with respect to the list, when I started developing this, and this is something you need to be aware of, this connection to the alpha cloud test databases can be slow. So when I first built this list, and this is going to be slow because I switched it over to do the test images, but I designed it initially using my SQLite connection because that's fast and local, and I didn't have to wait for a connection to open up through a secure channel to go all the way out to US East and then come back to my system with the information that was in it. So let's just quickly look at how I built this from scratch so you get an idea. So I started with a new UX component. I added my list, which I like to use add control because it's got everything in it. And so we'll call this photos. And then I went to the list quick setup genie. I picked my images connection string to my SQLite database. I grabbed my photos table, and I just got all the fields. Sorry. And this verify that the primary key is correct here. I also said, yeah, I want to persist this disconnected. Now this is local storage, and local storage is, you may or may not know, is limited to 5 megabytes. So that's just not going to work if you need to store things in it like images and so on and so forth. But I set that up just so it would be enabled. And then I said, make my list. That gave me photos. So after that, this just gives you a basic list. It's got, here's our SQL statement that we generated to connect to our database. The layout is already made for us. We don't need all the access information, so we could take that out and just keep these 3 things. And then in terms of the detail view, there are a bunch of different ways you can generate a detail view. We could have auto-generated it when we were going through the Genie. If you prefer to use in-place editing, you need to set it up here. In-place editing lets you edit in line versus editing in a bunch of extra components or controls, sorry. But once you have the detail view enabled, you can use the detail view quick setup genie to generate all the controls you need. So see, create one for all the unmapped. We'll include this recommended. We'll add our buttons. We'll say use the most commonly used buttons for actions. So save, undo, synchronize, delete, new record. And click OK. This is going to ask us where we want to add these controls in our UX layout. I would like to put it after the list because in the top to bottom kind of layout, that makes the most sense. This just tells us everything that it's going to generate. It asks, you want to wrap it in a container? I'm going to say no. I'm going to put this in a panel, and panel is not one of the container options. And there's also a label position option. It defaulted to none in my case. It may default to something else in yours if you've never done this before. But there's some options down here that you might like. Float above is nice, and we'll include that and just let those all generate. And so they'll show up here. And that's the initial setup, getting all the controls that we need for editing our records into this component. So right now, that's fine. That was telling me that I needed to change the return value to primary key because I had a detail view. For image capture, this little field right here, this image file field is the thing that stores the image. And we are going to use this in a mobile app. So we'd like to use the image capture for listed detail view. And to use that, there's a few things we have to set up. So the first thing we need to do is in our list data, we need to tell it that that image field is an image. So if we come over to fields and we select image file and come down to the client side area, we can say control type. Right now it sets to label. It always defaults to label. If you come in here and click those 3 dots, the smart field button is what we call it, you can come in here and change it to image. And if you change it to image, it gives you access to all the settings you need to capture your image. So put that there, and we'll say it's, so there's 2 sections here. There's the image properties, which is what is this image data type? What is in there? Is it the name of the image? Is it the actual image data encoded as base64 information? Those are your 2 options. But that's an important piece to know, how you've stored that image. And then the second thing is this image file transformation template, which we're not going to do now. We're going to do it after we've configured how the image is stored in the media capture settings on the detail view tab. But these are 2 things that you need to set. You can optionally say a no image found image. This has to be like a bitmap or a PNG, like an image file. You can't choose an SVG icon or a CSS icon as that image missing. But if you have an app where that could be a case where no image is a valid option for that image field, maybe you've got an employees table and only some of them have a picture, and for the others you'd like to show like a placeholder. This is where you can set that. And then down here in the section below, this is the detail view properties for this field, and it has a few things in it, whether or not it can be updated. We want that checked so that it can be updated. And then there's this image capture and storage properties, and this is one of the pieces you need to set up. So the image capture properties defines where that image is stored. And we're not going to use server. Server is the application server, and you can only use server if you're running the classic server or if you have an on-prem installation of the IIS server. You cannot use server on Alpha Cloud because, as mentioned earlier, the files on Alpha Cloud, if you modify anything in the web root at runtime with your application, that's not saved. And the next time an instance is spun up on Alpha Cloud of your app, it's going to be the stuff that was published. It's not going to have any knowledge of anything that you modified during a session, maybe even during the current session, because every Alpha Cloud site has 2 instances running. That's 2 servers, which is 2 copies of all your data in the web root, and that's not synchronized. So you cannot store dynamic stuff like images that you're uploading as part of a record on the server. It has to be in a third-party web service. So storage is where it's going to be saved. And the storage connection that we're using here is an Amazon S3 connection for storage because the Action JavaScript currently only works with Amazon S3 storage. Storage is set up on the web project control panel, and we'll go take a look at that later. But this is just defining location where things are saved. If you would like to modify images as they're being uploaded to storage, you can do that with this item name function. We're not going to really go into that too much. And then there's also this other option. If you upload an image that has an identical name to something else that's in there, do you want to overwrite it? Or do you want to make a new unique name and use that instead? So we're not going to do anything with this. We're not going to do anything with these Cordova options either because we don't need them for today. But something that we are going to talk about is this Cordova considerations link. And I recommend you read through this. It's a lot of text to talk about, but basically what it describes is how you need to configure your image file transformation template type. So what happens to the image name when it's read out of your database and brought down to the list? Does it need to just stay the same? So that would be the URL. In this case, if it's up on S3 of where that image is at, or does it need to transform into a different value? Perhaps you've stored the short file name and not the full thing, so you need to insert something into that path so it can find it again. Or in the case that we're going to use today, if you're going to download the images locally so they're available offline, you can just use something that's called value. So let's go. I would like to go take a look at the detail view next, but I feel like I need to click OK now and take you back over to web projects just to show you where you can set up storage connections. So that storage connection setting where I picked that Amazon S3 is defined over here in storage connection strings. And I'm not going to click on this right now because if I do, you're going to see all my secret storage connection string data, and I don't want to leak that in the webinar. But what you do is you would click in there and you create a new Amazon S3 connection. And if you've never worked with storage before, I strongly recommend that you come to our webinar in 2 weeks where we're going to be going over Dropbox and Google Drive. But I'm just going to pull up the documentation real quick for you. Talks about storage. So storage connection strings are like AlphaDio connection strings. They just define where your files are stored, your credentials to access them, and anything beyond that, maybe they're inside of a folder or a bucket, where to find it in that resource. So there's a bunch of different options for storage. Amazon S3 is the one that we built today, which needs to know the region where your Amazon S3 bucket is stored, where you've created it, your access key and your secret key. One of those things you can get when you're setting up your bucket. The other one was given to you when you made your Amazon S3 account, and if you've lost it, you need to go contact Amazon to figure out how to get a new one. And then the container name, which is the Amazon S3 bucket that you created for storing your files. So we did a presentation on this a while ago, and I don't know if Dave can find that link for you up in the YouTube or not, but we talked about this quite a bit. We're going to talk about it a bit more in the future as needed, but this is what we set up. Storage works with these XBasic functions. You don't need to know these to use the action JavaScript. But that's where you can find storage. So come back here in photos. So back on fields, image file, we looked at image capture and storage properties. The other place you need to go to set up your configuration for image capture is over in the detailed view tab. If you come all the way down, there's this really long property called media files, photo, video, audio recording, other settings. And if you open this, you'll get an error if you forgot to change where your stuff is stored. So we need to go back to the list properties tab and say that our files need to be stored in the file system on the device and not in local storage. So let's go over to list properties. We'll find the persist list data where, which this is only shown if you've checked persist data to storage. If you haven't checked that, that's not going to be there for you. But we're going to use file system. And just as a heads up, in the current release, the indexed DB option is indexed DB, but that's been changed to indexed DB with an extra ED. So if you are using that in the current release, just be aware that you may need to come in here and regenerate your application to handle this minor change. So we'll use file system. So now if we come over to detail view and we have the setting option and we open it, we're going to get another pop-up that says upload target, and it's going to default to server. And because we're going to Alpha Cloud, we need to change this. And in this case, our only option is S3. So Amazon S3, or if you're using Wasabi, you can use Wasabi as your connection. The target file name, you can change this if you want. I'm just going to use the default, which is a bunch of generated stuff. This TS, I think, means timestamp. E is the name of the mobile device that captured the image. List field name is the name of the list where this was being stored, and then your device ID. This is going to have a high probability of generating a unique file name for your images. If you want that to be something else, you're welcome to change it. There's a little insert example code here thing if you'd like to use an example. So I'm going to cancel out of that just to keep the same one. So we picked S3, our target file name. We're going to use a system default. Our connection string is our Amazon S3 storage connection string that I created previously. Protected read is optional. We're not going to use that. But what I am going to come down here is there's this setting called automatically download media files and other linked files when populating the list. And this is the thing you need to turn on if you want your images to be accessible while offline. And what this will do is it will download all those images onto the file system into a folder on the mobile device. You can change this name if you'd like. It defaults to underbar AA files. And that's just the folder for your app. This file system default is fine as the location. There's a bunch of other options in here. You can learn more about those later. There's also a few other options. Automatically delete unreferenced files. So if you have files in the mobile device's file system that aren't being referenced by this app, this will remove them for you. And this other option is ignore media files in the www subfolder. If you have files in the root folder, you can ignore downloading those. I'm not going to change any of these settings here. I will turn off displaying progress during media files download because I don't think we really need that for today. But if you've got a lot of images that need to be downloaded, it might be helpful for your users to display a progress bar if you discover that that takes a bit of time. So at least they know that your app is doing something and it hasn't hung. And then there's a bunch of customizations you can do in here, like what happens on a file upload, you can customize that error and so on and so forth. So we're going to do this option because what this will let us do is just use value as our decoded file name back on the field properties. You can do a progress display for uploads. There's no harm in leaving this on if you don't set it to anything, but I do like to turn things off if they're not configured fully, just so that I know that I don't need to worry about those settings. So we'll keep these settings here. And now we're ready to go back to fields and look at image file transformation template, which I'm going to use value. And what value means in the context of I've downloaded all the images to the local file system is to use that file system URL and not the online web URL where they're up in Amazon S3. So that's the setup and the configuration of your list for this particular scenario. The last piece is to configure your detail view. So the image file field needs to be an image if you'd like to see it while you're editing it, and you can do that by selecting what was generated and changing the control type from a text box to an image. And then the other piece that you need is a way to actually do the add an image. So we'll look at that. We'll click add control. I'm going to add a button. Click that. We'll say add image. You could say something else like camera capture or something, but we'll do add image. And then down here, JavaScript touch mouse pointer events, because this is a mobile app. We're going to add a new action. We're going to pick this image capture for list detail view camera photo library action. And click OK. Our image control is image file. If you don't configure that as an image, I don't believe it lets you actually select it here. So that is a critical step in setting this up. And then the image capture method, which defaults to HTML5, which is great for web applications, needs to be changed to either PhoneGap or PhoneGap preferred. So if you know this is just going to be distributed as a Cordova application, installed through the App Store or your own private distribution network, PhoneGap is fine. If you want to build something that could work in both web and mobile, when it's deployed, PhoneGap preferred, which will try to use PhoneGap if it's available and then fall back to HTML5 if it's not. And our data capture mode is not base64. We're not storing the entire image in the database. We're just storing the file name. And so I think at this point, these are all the settings we need to set up for just doing some basic image capture. If you wanted to store EXIF info, you would check this box and then configure that to store that information into your EXIF fields. But we're going to leave that alone. This is also optional. You can save the picture to the photo album after it's taken. Might be something you want to do if you'd like to be able to, have access to that image in other locations. Not required. It is not on by default, so just keep that in mind. And then also, can the user edit the picture after capturing it? If you turn that on, it'll allow some editing of the image. We're just gonna leave that off for now.
So that one setting, save picture to photo album, was actually kind of a big deal among people who are using alpha apps in a bring your own device scenario where the employees are out there taking pictures using their own phone of things that are work related, and they didn't want it to clutter up their own personal
Yes,
album of pictures. So that's just want to sort of point
that
out
yeah,
why
that
I
is
use
one
that one.
case. If you want to capture images but you don't want them saved on the device that the person is using, that leave it off. It is off by default. So if you'd prefer to have it on so they can access it later, I like to leave it on mostly because at least in testing, being able to just
Right, you
grab the
can
same
confirm
images
that. Look, I really did
before.
take that picture. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Just use the same images over and over again. But yeah, I did want to point that out. That's there. Picture source, if you've got PhoneGap preferred or PhoneGap camera, you can also default it to photo library, so they have to pick it from the photo library. The camera will let you, I believe the camera will let you do both if you have camera selected. And I haven't tested it thoroughly. I think you can access the camera if you're in the photo library. So, and then like a few other settings, maximum image size to upload and so on and so forth. These you can configure if you want to upload smaller images and reduce their size, but these are the settings that are important. There is some image message customization you can do here. If you don't like the messages we give you, then you're welcome to come here and change them. And then if you want to do any manipulation of that image data before it gets uploaded, or when something gets canceled, then you have access to that with client-side events. They're client-side events because all this happens on the device. There's no server involved whatsoever until the image is actually uploaded to the server. And then when it is uploaded to the server, there are other events that you can access to do things with it. Let's see here, upload target settings. I believe, yeah. So this is just to point this out, if you forgot to configure the media file settings on the detail view tab, you can also configure them right here in this action. It's all the same settings. It's the upload target, the target file name that gets generated for the image capture, the connection string of where it's stored, and then any of the download settings and the progress display things that you'd like to configure. So I'll click OK, do image upload, and just save that. And then I'm going to cheat and go over to the other one that I built earlier, because it's got all the same settings in it basically. So if we come and look at that add image here and we edit it, this is on private. It must default to private if that's the case. But it's basically all the same settings that we just went through. It's the same fields, it's the same database. No, let's not do that. And then on the list itself, we can look at that. I did tweak the the field so that if no image was found, it would at least display something. It should always be found the way this has been set up. But there we have our image file transformation template. It's value because we're downloading the files onto the device. Our image capture and storage properties. Oh, doesn't apply in this case because it's on file system. And then again, here's our media files and photos. S3, Amazon S3, and again, those settings. Cancel out of that. So in terms of building this, I would like to take the change that we made here. So if we live preview real quick, it's not going to look great, but we will at least see the field labels on our list detail view. So we have description and ID. There's our image file and then all the EXIF stuff. On this one, I'm going to take these out. We can always add in those controls later for the EXIF information. And then on these ones, I'm just going to put the label position. I'm going to turn it on. I'm just going to put it above on that one and then copy that to these two fields, our description and our image file field, and set those properties. And the other thing to note is these are wrapped in panel cards in a left to right layout. I'm going to keep that layout even though it doesn't look great on my device when I look at it, but my device is a tablet, so you can still see things. And so there's that layout ID, notebook ID. It's auto increment. We're not going to mess with it, but here's our add image, and this is going to default to the file system because it was set up for PhoneGap preferred. But that's the core of it. So we're going to save that. We're going to go take a look at the Cordova project itself. So once you've built your app, which you've done, the next thing you need to do is build your Cordova project. Well, you need to make an index page. Hold on a sec. For Alpha Cloud to be happy. I made one. It's called index, and I put just this H1 text on it, which oh, it looks like I closed it. Let's see here. I come over to Alpha Cloud, and I think it's View Cloud, and I pick my previews one here, and I just wait for this to update for a minute. Interesting. It didn't update that link. Let's go look at deployments instead. I don't know why I didn't update that link. I'll have to look into that. Oh, it's because I put it on my live test website. That's why. Well, that explains everything. Okay. So I'm just going to pull open that test index page for you so you can see what it looks like. If you go to that URL, and I'll even paste it in the chat for you guys. It's now an interactive demo. Probably shouldn't send out my live test link. Anyway, that's all it is. It just says photo capture basic. Alpha Cloud wants a page to exist when you publish, so you can set it up. It could be your app if you wanted to, put your component up there and test it in a web browser in addition to on your mobile device, or it can be anything you really want. But the key to all of that is just knowing what your URL is, so that when you set up your Cordova project, you know what your AJAX callback is for your component. So if we make a new one here, let's make it photo basic 2, and you're going to see an error message, and this is fixed in the next release of the nightly build. We can safely ignore it. But I set it up for Ionic Appflow. I built an Android app. My component is that photo capture basic UX, which conveniently is the only component I have in my application right now. My URL for AJAX callbacks is that URL my Alpha Cloud URL where I published my app, which I did separately, but it's just that basic URL without the A5W page at the end. The first time you do this, and really anytime afterwards where you need to regenerate the project asset files, you want to make sure asset files is checked. You want to generate your image resources. This stuff will, in Android's case, because we're building an Android app, I did not check iOS, but you can leave these blank and it'll default to something. iOS will default to something too for unset images. But down here, the other things we need to set up would be the application ID. This has to be unique to your app. So, sorry, it usually uses a reverse domain name style. So com dot your website name, Alpha Software or example. We could use example today. And then something else like photo test. The version, what your application is named, just shows up on the icon when it's installed on the device. So photo capture app, and this is a test application. You want to put an author, your email, an info link if you have a website where they can go get more information. Perhaps it's that A5W page you created. What supported orientations you have: landscape only or portrait only, default. Allow access origin. These are the default settings. I tend to leave them alone. Target SDK version has to be at least 30, or you can't put this up in the Google Play Store. You're going to see that Cordova Android 10.1.1 or later is checked, which should also make sure that insecure file mode is enabled is checked. If you're using the latest Android, so Cordova CLI 11, I believe, is the one that installs Cordova Android 10, which is the underlying framework for communicating with Android. These need to be enabled. And then beyond that, for image capture, there are a number of things you can choose from. For sure, you need to enable camera features for your Android app so that the people can access it. And then in terms of required plugins, if you're not using XF information, you can pick camera. There's a separate camera plugin though if you want to use XF. And then you also need file and file transfer, and file and file transfer let you do the thing that uploads files to your server or wherever they need to go. And then the rest of these settings, anything that Alpha Anywhere turns on, just accept the default. You're not going to have these options down here. These are custom plugins I added. This area will be blank if you haven't never done that, which you can do through manage my Cordova plugins. But once this is all set up, you can save and build for Ionic Appflow. I like to click save first and then do the save and build later in case just to go through and verify everything I've got is set up properly. But then when you save that, you can return to the Cordova builder and do this build for Ionic Appflow. I already did this earlier. I'm going to click save and build for Ionic Appflow so you can see what this process looks like if you've updated the components, which I did. So Ionic Appflow build process uses GitHub Windows and GitHub Desktop. And what this is just a graphical interface for working with Git repositories that integrates with GitHub. This one we added labels, I think. Yeah, so we'll commit that to main. We'll push to origin. And I'm getting a little sped up because I didn't realize how long this was going to take. But if we come over here, just disappointed. I already built this because this build process, if the resources aren't spun up for you already, it can take a bit of time for that to happen, like 15 minutes. So I already have this running in my emulator, already installed, and it's not going to look exactly like what we just created because I do need to create a new build, which I can show you how to do. So these are the builds I made. But if you've never done one before, you click new build on your app, you pick the build. The one at the top is always the one that you've created most recently. This is Android. I'm going to use the latest build stack. It's a debug build type. that's all I need to do, this is going to run. So it's going to take however much time it needs to take. But in the meantime, we can look at the previous iteration of this, which is right here. So this is the app. I installed it by copying it to the downloads folder on my Android device, which is plugged in over USB, which you need to, there's some setup involved there. But we tap add image. It will open the camera, which I was prompted to give access to when I first installed it. And you can see my colorful, dirty keyboard here.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's taking the picture. We click OK. Oh, I know this is the description field, so I'm going to just put some stuff in there. Let's see, keyboard. Tap out of that. We're going to save it, and it's there. It is on the right hand side or left hand side.
Mhm.
And we're going to tap synchronize, and it might take a minute for this to work because of the test database that I've got up on the cloud. But there we go.
Did it.
It's there.
Yeah.
It's synchronized. So you can see the little. There was a triangle up here, and now it's gone. That's synchronized. We can verify that by coming back into Alpha Anywhere on our photo capture basic and doing a live preview. And what we should see is that same data. There's keyboard. I don't know why notebook is here. I think
Was that already in the database when you had?
I think it might be cached. I've got it. I do this sometimes. I get into a weird state in my test environments. But there's our new record, basically. So that's image capture. And you know what we forgot to do? We forgot to go check our same site variable because it's the #1 thing we always forget to do.
Hey, that's
But
great. Because that was one of the questions. Was
yeah, if you're
how do you
using
make
IIS or Alpha Cloud,
cookie
here's where you
same
need to
site
go.
value? Right.
Cookie same site value. It's in your runtime properties for IIS and Alpha Cloud only. On the classic server, it's in the classic server settings on one of the tabs. You'll find it. It always defaults to strict. You need to change it to unset. If you don't, nothing will work. So that's where you find it. This is where you need to set it. It's very simple. Once you change it, you do need to republish your application. I'm going to wrap it up there because this is taking a while. And as you can see, this build is still going, but we do have 3 minutes for questions if people want to ask questions.
Fantastic. I'm sure we have more than 3 minutes worth of questions, but if you could pop back over to Alpha Anywhere though, just for a minute, we did have a question. Someone wanted you to point out again how you were able to migrate data from one SQL database to another. That's a tool that's built into Alpha Anywhere. So where does that live?
Yeah, so that's in tools.
Okay.
So tools are in tools.
Yep.
And it's in more, and it's called
More.
export from a SQL database to another SQL database.
Uh-huh.
So that's where you can find it. It's very handy for migrating between tables between databases. You know, if you're working with some test data and you want to go to production, or you've got a production database and you just want to pull down like a local copy of a few things, you can do that quite easily to migrate that data in. It doesn't. Do not think it works with stored procedures, and I don't know about views, so there are some limitations with it. But for tables, it's great.
Cool. All right. The other question was just back to Alpha Launch, and I know we had covered it briefly, but the question was, if I want to know the plugins that are in Alpha Launch, because after all, if Alpha Launch has those plugins in it, I might not have to build my own app. I could just use Alpha Launch and launch my app that way. How do I find out those things? So I happen to have the app open in front of me. So I'm not going to share my screen, but I'll just walk you through it. So just mentally picture this. You open up Alpha Launch to find this. You click on the Settings tab, or the Settings button at the bottom, and then there's another button which says Show Support Settings. That's off by default. You want to turn that on. When you turn that on, there's a bunch of little options underneath, 4 or 5, and one of them is called List Plugins. So as you can imagine, tapping List Plugins shows you the list of plugins. So that's the, oh, there you go. Thanks.
So yeah, turn that on.
Yep.
Tap this.
And that's how you do it. Yep.
Yeah, List Fungi plugins. You're gonna get a list. I don't think you can select and copy from it, but it'll be there for you.
You cannot. It's there, and it's surprisingly long. Actually, we give you a lot
It
of
is
plugins.
very long. There is a
Yeah.
lot of stuff in it. It has the camera with EXIF, so you can not only do camera photo capture, but if you also want to do the EXIF data, it's in there. It's got I do believe it has video and audio.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
a
a
bunch of
bunch of good
stuff.
stuff.
Yep.
Awesome. Hey, Sarah, thanks very much for presenting. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We look forward to seeing you in our next Alpha demo and Q&A webcast next week. Until then, take care and stay well.